Good afternoon. I couldn't do this earlier because they were doing lawn outside and it just was too loud. So, we're moving into the Patriarch, and what I'm doing is I'm going to go as quickly as I can because I have to divide this in half. So, let me switch you around and show you just basically this is Genesis 12 to 50, but we're only going to do to 25 and then we'll do another one after. So again, the narrative book, God's family plan, one holy tribe, the covenant, the area, the characters, world ruler, and all that kind of stuff. The covenant, all that. Okay, so just to kind of give you an idea, these are the 14 narrative books, but the 12 periods. We are in the second period. So that the early world was the first, this is the second. So, okay, same setup, the trailer, the narrative, and I took notes as I went through these so that when I read, I would know where I was and what was happening. So, believe me, this is the best way to read the Bible with him. So let me just start a little bit from last time. Jeff Cavins explained how Genesis 3 to 11 was kind of a history of sin due to disobedience. So that was kind of part one of God's plan. And then he explains in this covenant part that I missed that Babel was an attempt to organize human society apart from God, which, as we know, it's happening right now in our world. So it's very relatable to today. This is not an old book. This is a living history of humanity. Okay, so now comes the second part of God's plan to save humanity, starting in Genesis 12. As you can see, the key event is, so God calls Abraham at 75 from his father's house, still at his father's house at 75, I don't know. But Abram leaves and he doesn't fully trust God because his wife can't have children and God's promise seems impossible. Again, relatable to us today. We often cannot believe that what God can make possible. So Abram and Sarah get into Egypt. And Abram tells his wife how beautiful she is to behold, but he wants her to say she is his sister so they don't kill him. And the Pharaoh takes her into his home, as Abram said, and treats him well because of it. And then God sends plagues, and God tells the Pharaoh in a dream. It was actually Abram's wife. So here God talks directly to people in dreams, and he still does to us today. And so Pharaoh tells him, take your wife and leave. He was not happy about that. So then we move here into 13, and they leave Egypt and they go up to Negeb, where he goes and builds the Lord an altar. It's the first thing he does wherever he goes. He honors the Lord. He says, it says here, Abram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. So it seems God was blessing him. And Lot, his nephew, went with him when he left and went up through there. And they both have cattle and herdsmen. So they're both blessed. And their herdsmen begin to argue. But Abram was a good person, a loyal family member, and he said, look, we're family. There's no sense in arguing like this. Again, relatable and what we should do today. So in agreement, Lot moves more toward Sodom. And then God comes to Abram and says to him, once they separate, he says he will give him and his descendants land, and he tells him exactly where to go. And what does Adam do in loyalty when he gets to that land? He builds an altar. So then Lot, because he moved to Sodom, and we're told in 13 that these men in Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. So he gets in and there's going to be a rescue. But before we get to that, Jeff Cavins talks about the important points in the covenant with Abraham. And the important point that I found in Jeff Caven's explanation is St. Paul refers to the promise, and this is what Jeff put in there, refers to the promise as the gospel preached beforehand to Abraham. And St. Paul says that Abraham has priority over the law of Moses, given 430 years later. And Caven cites where in the Bible that is. And then he says that is God's plan revealed in advance. So, yes, these covenants are a roadmap, and they expand in how now into a holy tribe, from a holy couple to now the holy tribe. There's another one in between there. I'm sorry. Don't remember at this moment. And all these characters emerge as this includes more people, which eventually includes us. And as Jeff Caven says, salvation is for everyone. And then he explains why Israel are God's chosen people. And they are the instrument for all of our salvation. And it's not what you think. It's just profound. You really have to read that part. So the key events now in the next part are here to here, here to here. So the captivity and the rescue of Lot. I noticed that Abram's loyalty and how he rescued his nephew, and it's just very, very dramatic here. And then he meets his first priest, Melchizedek. When people say priests aren't in the Bible, well, yes, they are. And he blesses him in a prayer that's actually right here. It's a beautiful prayer. It says, "Blessed be Abram by God's most high, and the heaven and the earth, and blessed be God most high, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he lets him know that you are safe. Jeff Cavins talks about, and he pulls a lot of these parallels in, which helps you get through this Old Testament in other areas of Scripture where they're found, and how the sacrifice of this priestly king with food, bread, and wine is like that of Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus. So he pulls that in that you wouldn't get if you were just reading this dry. So then we get into 15. God comes to Abram and says, "Do not be afraid. I'm your shield, and your reward will be great." That's a promise. And Abram gives him a bunch of but. And not until later he finally recognizes and believes God. But because God gives Abram all these instructions, I don't quite understand all this animal sacrifice. It bothers me. But it is what it is. And then he gets to, he talks about Abram going into this deep sleep. And he tells him, once again, in sleep, he tells him, he warns him of the oppression coming for the next 400 years, but that he would bring judgment on the nation which they serve. And that's a little confusing, but he's telling him, because he's telling him the future, and he's not telling that his part in it, except that he would go on and he would be fine and he would be buried in old age. So I'm sure there's an explanation of this oppression somewhere, and it's an area I can look into that draws me further into the story because that interests me. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant, and it says, "Your descendants I give." And he talks about what he's giving to the descendants, exactly where. Egypt, from river to river, Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Hezatites and Calamites, and all these Hittites and Perizzites and Rephaim, and all these names in here. So I want to look a little further into that. This draws me into the story. So it creates some curiosity. So then we get into 16, moving forward, and here's where the trouble starts. They don't fully trust God, Abram and Sarai. And Sarai blamed God, and Abram listened to her. Boy, I don't know about these 2,000-year-old books and these women. I don't know if these women are divas or the men are just dumping it on the women. But it's interesting. And so they took matters into their own hands and let Hagar, their maid, Sarai's maid, have a baby for them instead of Sarai. And I think about all those who do in vitro fertilization, and I thought about being a surrogate when I was a young girl, and I'm so thankful I didn't, because I didn't realize. And so then the maid is used, and they treat her horrible, and Abram tells his wife, "Well, do with her what you will," just kind of. And that's so sad. Hagar is such a sad figure here. And Abram's failure to wait to discover how God intended to fulfill his promise leads to fighting amongst the Abrams family, all these women in the kitchen, if you know what I mean. So when Hagar, who's treated so horribly, runs away, an angel comes from the Lord and tells her, "You are with child. Go back and submit. And the Lord has given heed to your affliction. So her and her child will be taken care of." And the Bible actually gives the words that the angel spoke right in here. And he tells her to call the baby Ishmael. And she's so amazed. She cannot believe that these angels spoke to her. And it even tells where it happened. So I want to look, that piques my curiosity, the well of where that happens. So I'm going to look into that further. So then we get down here to the 17th, and this is back to the sign of the covenant. So what does God do? He gives a physical reminder, because he often does that in our covenants. And with Jeff Cavins explains that that's where he changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah, and also the physical reminder of circumcision. And it talks a little bit about that. And then we move in here to 18, a son promised to Abraham and Sarah. And they go into work. They go into the work. Most of us know about the promise of a son, Isaac, and Sarah was too old, but nothing is impossible with God. And it's just so interesting how Sarah is denying that she laughed. She laughed, and we all know that the Isaac name means laugh, but she denies that she did. So then we get to the key point up here, of Sodom and Gomorrah. And further into 18, we see how Abram's compassion comes up again, pleading for all those cities that God was going to destroy, because he tells them, "I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because it's evil and wicked," and says and so to me, Abram's pleading with him is his compassion, and we should be compassionate for those that are the LGBTQ STUV community. And then so they send the angels, but then the men try to rape the angels. And so God decides the city is going to be destroyed. And we have to look at that compassion that we can have for those sexually depraved, because ultimately they're going to destroy themselves. And that, to me, is what this says here. They won't listen here where they're told, and they won't listen there. But something I notice about reading it is I almost don't feel like reading this. I want to jump over it, just like Jeff Cavins does a little bit. And I don't know, but it's a little challenging. But I do feel Abram's desperation and his compassion. So that's important. He wants to save those people, and I think that's important. So then we move into the immorality of Sodom, and actually that's up here. And where the two angels come, and Lot says, well, he offers his two daughters who have not yet known men because he doesn't want them to hurt the angels. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's giving his innocent, vulnerable daughters to these violent men. But they don't listen, of course, because those sexually depraved people just do not listen. And so they rape the angels. And God says, no, they're being destroyed. So he tells them, and he warns Lot to, the angels warn Lot to take his wife and get out of, to get out of there, because he's going to destroy it. And he also says he tells Lot, he tells them not to look back. And of course, we all know the story that Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And I don't know, boy, these women in this Bible. And then the title of the shameful origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites. I really cannot say these names. Of course, we all know that the whole his daughters get him drunk and knows nothing. He knows nothing, and they do this so they can have children. That's just creepy to me. And they actually give the names of the children, and that these Ammonites today. So again, it gives their name, but the Bible says it is shameful. So. And then I noticed Jeff Cavins brushes over this part too, and I want to brush over to the next part. But a lot of details come out here in that God is speaking directly to different kind of people in dreams, which has happened to me, except not so clear in words like this. So I don't know why, but maybe it's the incest factor. Nobody likes to hear about that kind of stuff today. We don't go for that in this culture. So we get into 20 here. Genesis 20, Abram and Sarah go to Gerar. And Abram tells the king of Gerar that Sarah's his sister. But God goes to the king of Gerar, Abimelech, in a dream and tells him, no, Sarah is Abram's wife, and not to sin against Abraham's wife. And King Abimelech says, I didn't touch her. I didn't know she was his wife. And God says, because I didn't let you. I didn't allow you to. So God stepped in because God didn't want anything to interfere in his plan here. So we have free will, but it's within God's plan is what I took from that. So God also told King Abimelech that Abram is a prophet, and he ultimately stops the man from having sex with Abram's wife by threatening him and gives him a choice. You will die if you do, but if you don't, I will bless you. So King Abimelech is so scared that God told him this stuff and threatened him that he tells everyone, and everyone is all freaked out. So he goes to Abraham, and Abraham drops a bomb. He tells him that she really is my sister and my wife. I didn't know this. Because she's the daughter of my mother. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. So apparently Sarah is his half sister. That freaked me out. I didn't know that. So then Amalek gives them money and says, here, take this money, go, just go. He's scared of God's threats. And then he says something, it says something weird. It says, God restores all the wombs. And that was weird. So I wonder, these little things don't fit into our culture. Maybe that's why it makes it kind of hard to read, because it just kind of distracts us. So here, Isaac is born in 21, and Sarah says, God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh over me. And here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still laughing. And then it goes into Hagar and Ishmael are sent away because of Sarah's jealousy. She doesn't want him sharing with her son. God says, don't be mad at your other son, but do as Sarah says. And that to me says men should listen to their wives when it comes to jealousies like that. And then we get to the key point of the binding of Isaac, which is here. So before we get to Abram and Amalek, Abram and Amalek make a covenant. And that will come later. So that'll come later. But when they make that covenant, and this Beersheba, they dig this Beersheba well that was dug. So that's a detail that piques my curiosity, and I want to look into that part. So then we get here with the key event here, and we all know that the story of God testing Abraham and Abraham's obedience, which seems to contradict God's promises, Jeff Cavins explains. But being obedient, Abraham obeys and says to me, says to me, we need to obey even when it doesn't look right, because we don't know how it's going to turn out in God's plan. So the key event, he goes down to the binding of Isaac and allows Isaac, and he mentions, and Jeff Cavins mentioned how Isaac allows himself to be bound, and how that relates to Jesus allows himself to be, bound. And now we all know this. Isaac carries the wood, and Jeff Cavins points out Jesus carried the cross. See, he brings these parallels. So I'm reading this, and it just brings it to life, and it ties the whole story together. And then the location is the same. Again, another parallel. So if you're reading this dry, you don't get it. So that's why this kind of falls flat when you don't have that previous part of Jeff Cavins telling us all this stuff. And so it shows the foreshadowing and explains the divine oath, what the divine oath means. It just touches you that you're reading this and on God's faithfulness and not his people's. And he still saves us despite our wickedness. And there's something else that stood out to me as a parent, how Isaac binding his son and laid him on the altar and took the knife and ready to slay his son. And his son said nothing. And Jeff Cavins says that implies consent. But also to me, it says that our children are vulnerable to us, even as adults. And that kind of hit me in my heart a little bit, thinking of my own children. I'm trying to always remember that. And then the some words jump off the page at me. And further down, when he tells Abraham that he gets to the part and says, your descendants will possess the gate of their enemies. I don't know what that means, but it makes me curious that I want to look further into that. So then we get into 23, and Sarah dies and is buried, and she only lived 120 years. So that was interesting, because some of these people were living 800 and 900 years. So it goes into a bunch of details of buying the cave and how much it was and where she's buried. And I just wonder why some of these kind of details are in here. I don't know. So 24 gets into the marriage, and Abraham is old, and Isaac comes in marriage with Rebecca. So Abraham gives his servant some instructions and makes him swear on his thigh of all places to take his son Isaac somewhere to find this maiden, Rebecca. Oh, well, he doesn't say the name, but he pays him for it. It's a little confusing, and then he does a lot repeating the story that Abraham told the servant, and then the servant tells these people who give him Rebecca, and they take him back. The servant takes him back to Isaac, and he loves her, and it repeats about Rebecca and says that they get Rebecca. She'll be the mother of thousands and will possess the gates of those who hate them. So that's a little weird how they talk about the gates of those who hate them. I think it's there, or is it the next one? Yeah. So that was a little weird. So then, and then it says that it helped him get over his mother's death. It comforts him in his mother's death. So that I found interesting personally. And then Abraham takes another wife. Abraham takes another wife. I never knew that. She gave him a bunch of sons, and all the names are here, very strange names. And he gave them all gifts, but he gave Isaac everything. And then it jumps into Abraham finally dies of old age, and he's buried with Sarah. Then it jumps to the descendants of Ishmael, and then Isaac and Rebekah's children with the birth of the twins, Esau and Jacob. And the Bible clearly says 20 years they were married before they had these children. And then further down in 25, Esau is despising his birthright, and Jeff Cavins explains that spiritually something analogous happens when we commit serious sin. We despise our birthright as sons and daughters of God for a fleeting moment of self-indulgence. And then he adds the other part of the scripture that points to that. So we all know Esau sells his birthright for a pot of food, and Jacob steals Esau's birthright. Esau was his dad's favorite, and Jacob was his mom's. Rebecca's favorite. So that's it for that part. It was very long, so I wanted to go through quickly, and then the next part will be the other part. So thank you for listening, and I'll try to keep moving as quick as we can.